The committee for the whole is back in order. Senator Ada?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move that we suspend discussion on Bill number 157-34 COR.
On the motion, any
Objection,
objection?
Mr. Speaker. On the motion.
Okay. There's been objection on the motion, on the notwithstanding motion. All those in favor? No. Of going to, setting aside, suspending the discussion. Motion fails. We stand in recess.
Good morning, Senators. The committee hall is now back in session. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for your previous chairmanship. Senators, we do have, after the reconsideration of the decision of the body, we still have the amendment. I was corrected in terms of the process and the approach because by virtue of the, first of all, let me go back. The amendment was closed in discussions and was voted on. It received sufficient votes to be inserted into Bill 157-34. Then there was a motion to reconsider. That motion to reconsider the actions of the body was successful, and we are now on the amendment, which has already been closed with discussion. I understand that there may be one or two of our colleagues on the floor that may want to amend that amendment before we vote on it again for possible placement on Bill 157-34. So, Senators, if we're on the same document, it's beginning on line 26, page 24 of the bill, to add a new sentence to the definition of system to read as follows. System shall not include non-revenue generating activities as defined in the authority's financial records, specifically its chart of accounts. And it's sponsored by Senator Nelson. I know, Senator Nelson, on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to make an amendment. I know there was, yesterday it was brought up in the accounts that the non-revenue generating activities is not specifically defined properly as in the chart of accounts. So I'm looking here at the chart of accounts now, and I'd like to make an amendment that says non-operating revenues. So system shall not include non-operating revenues as defined in the authority's financial records. So
Senator Nelson, if you can restate again your amendment.
Yes. It should say, system shall not include non-operating revenues as defined in the authority's financial records, specifically in its chart of accounts.
Everyone understand the amendment? Non-operating revenues as defined in the authority's financial records. Any discussion on the amendment to the amendment? Yes, Senator
I'm just
Torres.
wondering, Mr. Chairman, if that in fact would be an appropriate term for system, because a system involves an activity. So perhaps what the mover of the amendment means to say is non-operating revenue generating activities, because an activity is part of the system.
I'm sorry, Senator Torres, I'd like to entertain your amendment to the secondary amendment, but because it's a secondary amendment, we need to dispose of that first. And then should it pass, then I will entertain you at that time.
Okay, I was trying to preempt.
No,
I was trying to preempt the amendment before it was acted upon, but I understand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Torres. Any other discussion on the proposed amendment?
Mr. Chair, could you just read it?
Yes.
Sorry, one more time, please.
Okay. Senator Nelson, because you're the one that proffered it, would you like to restate again the amendment?
Yes, the amendment should read, system shall not include non-operating revenue as defined in the authority's financial records, specifically its chart of accounts. Mr.
Madam
Chair,
Vice Speaker, did you get that? It's system shall not include non-operating revenues, comma, as defined in the authority's financial records, specifically its chart of accounts. Vice Speaker Talai? One minute recess. Committee in the whole is back in session. Senator Talahi, Vice Speaker Talahi, you have the floor. Are you good? You have a copy of the amendment? Okay, once again, on the amendment to the amendment, any further discussion?
Point of information, Mr. Chair. I just want for clarification, was it not the position of the Port Authority and GITA that this amendment, any such amendment to this effect, would adversely affect the bond package that's been presented?
Based on your question, the answer is an affirmative, yes. On the amendment to the amendment, to insert, once again, for clarity, because one of our colleagues just received a copy of the
Mr.
amendment.
Chair, point
Yes.
of information.
Yes, Senator Nelson, state your point of information.
That affirmative yes that they gave to go out to say that it would adversely affect was a hypothesis. It is not concrete, it is not accurate, it is not factual. It's a hypothesis. It's an educated guess. Thank you, Mr.
So
Chair.
noted. Thank you very much, Senator Nelson. Once again, the amendment would read, the amendment to the amendment would read, system shall not include non-operating revenues, comma, as defined in the authority's financial records, specifically its chart of accounts. On the amendment to the amendment, any further discussion? If not, any objection on the amendment to the amendment? There's been an objection. Senator Morrison?
Mr. Chair, before we proceed with this,
I'm sorry, was that an objection or you were raising your hand to discuss?
discuss just
Okay, Senator Morrison, you're recognized.
before we proceed, Mr. Chair, Gita's outside, and I believe we would proceed so we don't continue going down this road and come back to again or reconsider. I think they're willing to provide more information in regards to this amendment or the recent amendments or any amendments going forward. So at least we can get any further validation on what we're doing here. So that way we can make a responsible vote.
So noted, Senator Morrison. 2-minute recess, Sergeant at Arms.
Point of
Please invite
information,
the
Mr. Chair.
previous panel members in. Yes.
Point of information.
Yes, Senator Nelson.
As is discussed in the previous days, Mr. Chair, that GITA only consulted with their bond counsel and their legal representative of the underwriter. No, in anywhere that did they include the legislative legal advice within this write-up of a bill that us senators have the duty to pass. And if, God willing, it becomes law. So we've been hearing the side of GITA going by a bill that they wrote without any input from our legal within our separation of powers. So, Mr. Chair, I'd like to move. If there's an objection, I'd like to vote on it so that we can move forward.
But Senator Nelson, there's been a request by one of our colleagues that there's additional information that may be available from the GITA representative, and that applies to this amendment. So 2-minute recess. Sergeant at
Thank you,
Arms,
Mr.
please
Chair.
invite the panel members in. Senators, the committee in the whole is now back in session. Just for the information of the GITA representative, now that she's in the hallway, we do know that they were watching in the other room. The proposed amendment, as the amendment has been proffered, is it would read, "System shall not include non-operating revenues, comma, as defined in the authority's financial records, specifically its chart of accounts." Senator Morrison, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank Gita for being here, and I'll ask if Ms. Garcia could provide any further comments.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again? I'm sorry, Senator.
I basically, Mr. Chair, I requested Gita to provide any further information that she may have of our closing of our discussions yesterday, that she will work with bond counsel to validate any further information.
Thank you, Senator Morrison. Ms. Garcia?
Thank you and good morning. I did pose the question with both bond counsel and the underwriters. Bond counsel, as requested, bond counsel was not able to respond because they're not an active player in the bond market. The response we did get back from the underwriters is that in general, ports do pledge all their revenues. It helps with the credit. It helps with the interest rates. Ports in general are volatile credits because are most volatile than power and water, and so all the revenues are required to be pledged in order to get the best rating possible. By bifurcating the rating, it will be a big credit question for both the rating agencies and investors because, as stated, we are talking a long-term debt. We don't know what could happen long-term. In 10 years, future port managers can start redirecting revenues to that area. So in all, again, you're looking at interest rate risk and so in general, all ports do pledge their system revenues. Bifurcating will hurt the credit. Bifurcating we will need to readdress, Chairman, our interest rate cap because, again, it will be unattainable under those conditions. So that was the discussion we had. I'm trying to get more details for you. I'm just not able to print right now, but that's, in general, that's the port criteria for going into the market.
Thank you very much, Ms. Garcia. Senator Morrison, you still have the floor. Any other comments? Okay. Senator Nelson on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Garcia, I want to thank you for being patient with us and giving us the information that we've been asking for. I know it's been a long week, but thank you for your patience and your professionalism. You stated earlier that this is what is done with all ports. Is this all ports within the continental U.S.?
What I stated was, in general, all revenues are pledged to get the best credit rating. And so I'm trying to get examples, details, and we're still working on that. But for the Guam credit, again, we're already at a higher risk factor because we're an isolated island community. By not pledging all the revenues, we will have a harder chance at getting a good credit rating as well as investor interest. We will get it, but it will be at a higher cost to the people of Guam, to the people paying tariffs, and to the port. So that's what we wanted to present to you. Again, putting our best foot forward.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask, because Guam's location, essentially the U.S. hub for Asia, is there any port similar to our port that we can compare?
I don't know that answer. I'm not in that port industry business.
I see. And the reason why I pose this question, Mr. Chair, is because of our location, there are certain operations and trading that goes on because of our location, because we are placed in Asia. And so if we can get some kind of information in regards to a similar port that is likely the similar location or influence within Asia that it has, then I believe that that would be more concrete than to compare us to either Puerto Rico or any other hub within the United Continental U.S. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Nelson. Senator Castro, on the amendment to the amendment.
Ms. Garcia, just as a subject matter expert in the room, I'm just looking for a yes or no answer, okay? So I'm going to ask it. Will the amendment, as it reads, adversely affect, or in your words, jeopardize, the bond package that GITA deems to be the best possible scenario for the territory? Yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Senator Castro. Any further discussion on the amendment to the amendment? If not, I will yield to the sponsor of the amendment to the amendment. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Garcia, is that a fact that it will jeopardize, or is it a hypothesis?
This being my first port bond, I'm relying on the market data and the market, the folks that have issued port bonds. And based on their experience, based on their advice and counsel, and these are top underwriters of port bonds, they have provided this information to me that I'm providing to you. So based on the current market, this is what this is where my information is coming, based on current market.
Does the market fluctuate?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. We've concluded our discussion on the amendment to the amendment. There's been an expression of objection. All those in favor of the amendment to the amendment, the primary amendment, please signify by raising your hands. 2, 4, 5, 1, 2. The amendment to the amendment, that's correct. Changing the term. 6. Amendment fails. On the original amendment as proffered, any further discussion? If not, there's been a a show of objection. All those in favor of the amendment as initially proffered, please signify by raising your hand. On the original amendment as proffered, without any amendments, we are pleased, if you are in support of this amendment, signify by raising your hands. Four, amendment fails. Senator Nelson, I'm sorry. Senator Ada, I know you raised your hand. Did you have any further discussion on the legislation? Yeah, prior to the reconsideration vote, you had raised your hand. Okay. Thank you, Senator Ada. Any further discussion on Bill 157-34 as amended? Senator San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to open once again by reiterating, I would say maybe 90% of all of the discussion over these last, going on 6 days now, has been focused on what is Section 2 of this bill. I've been referencing it as Section 1, but that was an error because there's a numbering error on the bill. There are 2 Section 2s. This section that we've been debating 90% of the time was the rewrite of Article 2 in the Guam Code that spells out the borrowing authorization for the port. And this rewrite, as I've proffered over these past several days, does a lot of things that basically spell out that the people of Guam, if this section passes, the people of Guam, through their elected representatives, will be excluded from the process of going into the debt market by the port. And by excluding the people of Guam via their elected representatives, all that would need to happen is the port board would need to authorize a debt, and then they would just need to get approval from the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, to raise any tariffs to pay for that debt. And neither the port board nor the PUC are elected by the people of Guam. I'm opening my discussion on this measure today to talk about that once again, but this time part 2, because there's more information in this bill that further underscores that this is exactly what will happen if we pass this section. I'd like my colleagues to, if they would be so kind, to reference page 26, starting on line 11. It's a very curious piece of language that is inserted into this bill. And I'm going to read it into the record. It states, "It is hereby declared." Just those 4 words alone, Mr. Chairman, are very, very odd, because rarely do we put into legislation a declaratory statement. It is hereby declared that the system is and shall be a public improvement or undertaking, as that term is used in Section 11 of the Organic Act, Section 1423A, Title 48 U.S. Code. That's the first sentence of this section that I'm going to read. And again, there is something very unique about that first sentence, because rarely do we put in any legislation a declaratory statement about the Organic Act. It goes on to read, "All indebtedness issued or entered into by the authority pursuant to this Section 10203 shall be repayable only from funds of the authority available therefore, or solely from revenues of the system, and, therefore, will not be and shall not be deemed to be public indebtedness of Guam, as that term is used in Section 11 of the Organic Act." Now, on the surface, that declaratory statement sounds good. You sit back and you say, wow, okay, yeah, we definitely want to make it very clear that this bond will only be paid by revenues and it will not be indebtedness of Guam. But when you actually dig into what's happening here, in the context of what I spoke about earlier with respect to the extrication of the people of Guam from this process, this statement is actually, from my perspective, the smoking gun that the intent of why this whole Section 2 was drafted by quote-unquote bond counsel was to remove the people of Guam from the process. Because when you pull up this section in the Organic Act, a very curious thing happens. Section 1423A, Scope of Legislative Authority. The legislative power of Guam shall extend to all rightful subjects of legislation not inconsistent with the provisions of this chapter and the laws of the United States applicable to Guam. Taxes and assessments on property, internal revenues, sales, license fees, and royalties for franchises, privileges, and concessions may be imposed for the purposes of the government of Guam as may be uniformly provided by the legislature of Guam, and when necessary, to anticipate taxes and revenues, bonds, and other obligations may be issued by the government of Guam. A couple of sentences later in that same section, it reads, bonds or other obligations of the government of Guam payable solely from revenues derived from any public improvement or undertaking shall not be considered public indebtedness of Guam within the meaning of this section. This language in this bill is basically, if we pass this, y Legislatura ng Guahan admitting or affirming or hereby declaring that this is not being considered an obligation or public indebtedness of Guam, and so no longer requires the involvement of the Legislatura. This section, along with the other areas that I've pointed out over these past 5 days, along with the special powers and authority granted to the board of the port, and the ability for the board to allow for the management of the port to set the terms and conditions of indebtedness, the removal of the governor, the automatic approval of these measures, all written into this bill, would, in a nutshell, construct an environment within this borrowing system where all that needs to happen is the port just needs to approve an indenture, the PUC just needs to approve the rate increase, and the port can bypass the legislature, not involve any elected officials, not involve the people of Guam, and go directly to the bond market. Now, there's been talk over these past several days about how we're trying so hard to somehow restructure the entire borrowing authorization of the port to match autonomous agencies. And over the course of our discussions, the subject of YTK has come up. And we need to understand that YTK happened because there was a lack of oversight. It was the port board that made all of those decisions. And now what we're going to do with this act is allow for that very same entity to be able to incur indebtedness on behalf of the people of Guam without the involvement of the Legislatura, without the involvement of the Magalahan Guahan, and in so extricating both parties, the lack of involvement of Legislative Legal Counsel, the lack of involvement of the Attorney General. Interestingly, we say that we need to do all of this in order to get the best interest rate rating, and yet if I was a lender, knowing that that very same board made a decision that resulted in a $14 million YTK liability that's potentially coming down the pipeline, I would be very concerned that there is a lack of oversight, a lack of involvement of the Attorney General. So I'm not quite sure whether or not the intent is to try and make this more attractive to investors, or whether we're just trying to create a system that's going to allow us to make the port go out and borrow with as little oversight as possible. And that concerns me. Because of all the autonomous agencies, the only ones with a pending $14 million judgment against the decisions of its board is this port. I've also just been listening very closely to all the discussions about how we're trying to go out and get the best interest rate and the best deal on this bond. And the reality is that, of course, the more you throw into this offering, perhaps the more likely you're going to be able to get a better deal. But I had a conversation with a colleague the other day, and I asked him, I said, hypothetically speaking, if this port was a private operation, do you think that they'd be going out and trying to borrow in this exact same manner? Would you go out and offer everything that you can possibly offer, put it all on the table, encumber all of your revenues, encumber all of your assets, your entire system, to go out and take out a bond that has, by comparison, a very narrow scope? And the gut reaction from this colleague was, no, of course not. As a private entity, you would go out and try and get the best deal possible with the least amount of commitment necessary. And that is why I'm very concerned about the representations being made, because whose interests are being protected here? Are we trying to please the underwriters, or are we trying to make sure that the people of Guam and the Port Authority of Guam is getting the best deal for the least amount of commitment? Of course the underwriters are going to say, throw everything in there. They're the ones who are going to be selling the indenture to the investors. They look like heroes every time they bring a bond to the market with all the bells and whistles written into it. The way the investment world works is oftentimes the underwriters are a division within a larger parent company that also just so happens to have a subdivision that represents the very investors who are buying the bonds. And they call it a Chinese wall, where the underwriter is supposed to keep its activities separate from its investor's house. But at the end of the day, that is oftentimes not the case. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I've always been interested in doing, and I would like to put this on the record, is it would be very interesting if we could get an investigation on all of the historical bond issuances that we have had to determine if there has ever been any collusion between the underwriters and the investment divisions that are under the same house. We should not be letting underwriters and their attorneys participate in the drafting of our legislation that's going to govern the way we borrow. That's like asking a company on Guam, let's not throw around any names, but that's like asking a company on Guam to have their attorneys draft up our procurement laws. It is on the record. It is part of this hearing. It is a part of this committee of the whole. It's in the email that was provided. Bond counsel Tagida worked with the underwriters in drafting this legislation. That's like saying Public Works' legal counsel sat down with Cortec to draft the procurement law. Let's pass it.
Senator San Nicolas, do you have an amendment?
I'm speaking about the main measure, Mr. Chairman.
You had an opportunity at the inception of the discussion of the bill to speak on the measure. So that's why we are entertaining
And I deferred that,
amendments.
Mr. Chairman, for other discussion from my colleagues, and I'm continuing my opportunity that I deferred.
Your time was exhausted initially, but proffer an amendment, Senator.
And so with that, I mean, knowing all of that, we cannot responsibly consider passing this Section 2. If we're going to be drafting up the law of this land, it should not be written by the very parties who stand to benefit from it. They stand to materially benefit from it. The underwriters are going to be putting these measures into action for the benefit of their investors And because they generate fees as a result. It's even on the record that the bond council will generate fees as a result. GITA generates fees as a result. None of the parties are fiduciaries to the people of Guam. We are. And as that last line of defense, we should not pass this Section 2 that abdicates that and turns it over entirely to the very board that already has a history of outcomes such as YTK.
Senator Nicholas, I've yielded a lot of time to you for your discussion. Do you have an amendment?
My first amendment is starting on page 2, line 13, to page 45, line 7, striking that entire portion of this legislation.
On Senator San Nicolas's amendment on line 2, page 2, line 13, all the way through page 45 through line 7 for the deletion of those particular sections. Any discussion? Senator Nelson, you're recognized on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to clarify, we're deleting the entire Section 2?
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank my colleague for this motion, but I have a concern that we remove Section 2 and provisions must be made to Section 3, if that's the case. And just knowing how us as a body, we have to vote on provisions for Section 3. And so I just wanted to be brought out that it's not an objection, but you can't have one without the other. And so I'm thinking, does the proffer of the amendment have a solution? And what would, if we can even discuss it, if there's a possibility of what would be inclusive in Section 3, since we're removing everything out of Section 2, which basically sets the terms and conditions of the borrowing of the bond.
We're entertaining the amendment proffered by Senator San Nicolas, and that is to delete lines from page 2 all the way to page 45 through line number 7. Okay, so that's the amendment on the floor. I understand your suggestion, but we have an amendment on the floor for consideration. Any further discussion on the amendment? Senator Esteves, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I appreciate the concern and comments by the previous speaker. In many ways, I do agree. I think there needs to be a certain level of accountability with an elected body, and a complete match of the other autonomous agencies and public utilities may not be completely prudent. However, I do think aside from deleting the entire section, I do think there are other options to still accomplish the same goal. I would be willing, if you were to look at 10203, and then just not as a matter of discussion, Mr. Chairman, just as a matter, I think, of an option looking to the future. On page 25 with section 10203, the provision exists in that in section 2 that they are still subject to the requirements under Title 12 GCA 12116. But just in this section alone, it still says that the board is authorized to exercise the powers granted to them. In agreement with the sentiment put out, and because it would not be germane to this piece of legislation, I'd be willing, and with that in mind, if this measure passes, specifically the bill intact as it is, I will revisit the powers of the Port Authority Board to incur indebtedness. I think it would be a simple amendment to the powers of the board to require legislative improvement or approval before they incur any additional indebtedness. So it wouldn't just be the bond itself in this measure, because this single act authorizes them to take the bond, but any indebtedness in the future with regards to any type of bank loan, as we've seen in the past through ANZ or Bank of Guam, would require legislative approval. I think that is a good trade-off, because we are an elected body and we are a fiduciary, and that would be not just inclusive of any loans, but any future bonds. That them not being an elected body and an appointed body, it would require that any indebtedness of the port would require legislative approval. So I think that could still solve the issue. But the reason I cannot proffer an amendment, Mr. Chairman, is because changes to the powers of the board, I don't believe would be germane to this piece of legislation, which is authorizing them specifically to borrow, in this instance, the $72.6 million we're going to be approving for this bond. So outside of that, outside of this, and what we've been talking about for the past 5 days, I think there's definitely merit to the argument that the Port Board is not an elected board and they are not a fiduciary of Guam. And I'd be willing to visit that at a later date to address those issues. But for the task at hand, I think the necessity for them, based on the merits of the bill, to obtain the bond, at this time, I cannot agree to the amendment, because I think it would negatively affect the ability to actually obtain the bond. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Esteves. Senators, we're going to call for the vote on the amendment by Senator San Nicolas. Senator Ada, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a concern with the sweeping amendment that's being suggested. So basically what happens is, the way I see it is, if we delete from page 2 to 45, what in essence we end up with is the existing bond guidelines, right? And so if we take a look at the existing bond guidelines, it allows the port to go and borrow at a rate not to exceed 9%. So I guess we're going to need, given that, we're going to need to go in and fix, I guess, the section 3 or whatever, and tweak that so that it's, notwithstanding section 10209, your interest rate shall not exceed 6 point. So we can't just make so if we're going to make we're going to say the things that we're saying in section 3, then we're going to need to put in additional language in the what remains then of the bond guidance. And so I'm concerned that we go in there and we do that, and there's implications to what we have done in section 3. And not having had a chance to now go back into section 2 of the original, I'm not sure if we're still consistent. So I'm just concerned about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Ada. Vice Speaker Talai, on the proposed amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support this amendment. I think it's an excellent amendment, and it really points out that the concerns that I think we've all had with this bill in general, that the bill does two major things, and it's I don't think the legislature should be, while we're trying to consider one specific revenue bond, that we should be, kind of almost by default, because, it's hard to give enough attention to these very, changing the enabling act of the port to allow all this borrowing in the future under these terms now, these very broad terms. If we are able to authorize this specific revenue bond in accordance with the terms in Section 3, and I admit that might require, I don't even know if it even requires, but if it does, then we would have to maybe add additional provisions to Section 3, but I think that's work that we actually should do to be very accurate and very fair to the people of Guam as to what we are actually authorizing by this one particular revenue bond. Because no one has a problem with authorizing this one particular revenue bond at this cap, at this interest rate for these purposes. We want to do that. What we don't want to do is open up the doors for and change the enabling legislation of the port that says that in the future they can do any kind of bond with all these varied indentures provisions as options, and the option whether the port can come up with any indenture that it wants, that we haven't even reviewed in these last 5 days. That should be of concern to everyone. And it might take a little bit of work to maybe, council and Gita to just review and make sure what other items we might need to put in Section 3 if we adopt this amendment. But I think this amendment is very good because it very clearly highlights that this whole part, and an earlier speaker had said, we should separately consider the port's authority. Well, that is what this amendment is trying to do, is to say that general authority that the port might have for bond borrowing now and in the future. This entire Article 2 it's rewriting the port's current bond authority. It repeals the existing Article 2 in the statute.
My apologies. Point of information, Mr. Chair.
Excuse me.
Senator Esteves, if you have a point of information, please state your point of information.
Just for accuracy.
Otherwise, Vice Speaker Talai has the floor.
Just for accuracy, and I'm not going to speak on that, but just for accuracy, the powers of indebtedness and authorizing indebtedness is not in this. It's in the same chapter. It's still under 12 GCA, but it's in the enabling legislation of the Port Board that allows them to already incur indebtedness without any requirement from anyone else. So that doesn't exist in this bill. That's not what we're rewriting, Mr. Chairman, and that's why in my previous statement I had said that it would have to be in a different bill because the authority to incur indebtedness is not in this section. It's in the enabling legislation of the Port Authority Board. And that's what I was trying to get at. Doesn't matter what we do here, Mr. Chairman, whether we were to remove the entire amendment or not, the Port Authority Board still has that power because of their enabling legislation.
That's
Thank
correct,
you, Senator
Mr.
Esteves.
Chair.
Thank you for your point of
Thank you.
information. Vice Speaker Talai.
Thank you very much. And that is correct. The port has in its enabling legislation a very general provision that says they may, I don't know, what does it say, enact bonds or approve bonds, but we also passed many laws subsequent to that that says GIDA is going to review it, the legislature shall review all bonds, and it says, and then they put in this Article 2 to the enabling legislation of the Port Authority that tells them how they are
Senator
going to consider bonds.
Vice
And Article
Speaker.
2 is on page 2 and 3 of our bill, so it's very relevant to what we're talking about right now. In fact, it's the subject of the motion that we're talking about right now, to exclude, to rewrite this entire article that currently dictates how the port conducts its borrowing. And I support the amendment, Mr. Chair, because it protects the people of Guam. It will require us to be very careful in what general provisions we are going to incorporate for all future bond borrowing for the port. It's actually not necessary for today's borrowing, for today's revenue borrowing. I think we can be very specific, and we've tried to do that in Section 3. And if there's any other language that we need to include that's not there, then I think a review by council and GITA would be able to tell us that. And otherwise, that's very fair. It's fair to the public. It's fair. It doesn't delegate out all future authority of the legislature. It keeps the authority of the legislature, because if you see Section 3, page 45 in line 15, it says, "Il legislature en Guahan, pursuant to Section 50103K of Title 12, hereby approves the issuance and sale of revenue bonds."
On the
And then
amendment, Madam Vice Speaker.
It proceeds to talk
On
about
the-
in
on
this
the
amount.
amendment,
I am
please.
on the amount, Mr. Chair. And then it proceeds to talk about the amount and the exact terms of this one particular revenue bond. And so that's all we need for today, is to tell them what are the terms for this one particular revenue bond. And for all future revenue bonds, we should very carefully consider, and that all future revenue bonds are controlled by Article 2. On page 19, the brand new Article 2 that is being proposed in this bill at the same time that we're trying to just take care of one revenue bond, it takes care of all future revenue bonds. And that's where I just feel like it's not necessary, it's too much to do, it's too much to delegate out from the legislature at this point in time. And so I support the amendment, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Vice Speaker. Yes, 7 minutes discussion. So, Senator San Augustine, you have the floor.
Can we move to vote? I think there's an objection, there's an agreement. Can we just move to vote?
There's been a request for, yes, Senator Muñoz.
I wanted to find out, maybe from Mrs. Garcia, what are the consequences if we take out this section? How would it affect the bond? If I can ask her that question.
As mentioned, I think earlier in the week, this section was written, it's outdated, it was written in 75, some updates in 1980, and it was written when the Port Authority was a line agency, and the proposed amendment, which to some regard is similar to what was written to create the autonomy of the successful autonomous agency. And so, again, by taking this out and rewriting it, it puts us in a creating the true autonomy of the port. By not approving it or by keep trying to issue bonds under the current authorization, it would probably follow under the government credit, which is a B credit, versus the triple B that we're trying to obtain.
Senator Muñoz, does that answer your question? Thank you very much for your question. Senator Ada, and then we're going to call for the vote. Yes, Senator Ada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just, so it seems that with this discussion, we're saying that what was originally intended with the new Article 2 was in recognition of the fact that the existing Article 2 is really obsolete, so to speak, right? So I guess we don't want to go back and use the obsolete guidelines that's in the books right now. So it just seems to suggest then that if we're going to delete, if we're not going to in this bill update Article 2, that the only recourse we have then to make sure that the bond covenants are satisfactory to this legislature is we say, yeah, you can go out and borrow and all that stuff, draft up the bond covenants and bring it back here for us to take a look at. So, you know, I mean, I don't know whether they would do that after they go to market or before, you know. This is what they're going to go out to the market with. So, and that language, you know, I mean, if so that provision is going to need to be put in here. If this amendment passes, then we're going to need to put that language in here that says, draft up your bond covenant, bring it back here, but until that's done, you're not going to market. That's in essence what we're saying.
Thank you, Senator Ada. There's been a call for the vote on and there's been an expression of objection. All those in favor of the amendment by Senator San Nicolas to commence on page 2, line 13, section 2, to delete all subsequent pages through page 45, line 7, on the amendment.
Roll call, Mr. Chairman. Request for roll call vote.
There's one call for a roll call. There's two. Okay, Senators, there's been a request for roll call on this particular amendment. Clerk? We're voting on the proposed amendment.
Senator Adda. Senator Adda, pass. Senator Uggan. Senator Uggan, nay. Senator Castro. Senator Castro, pass. Speaker Cruz. Speaker Cruz, aye. Senator Espadon. Senator Espadon, nay. Senator Esteves.
Aye.
Senator Esteves, nay. Senator Lee. Senator Lee excused. Senator Morrison. Senator Morrison, nay. Senator Muñoz. Senator Muñoz, pass. Senator Nelson. Senator Nelson, aye. Senator Rodriguez. Senator Rodriguez excused. Senator San Augustine. Senator San Augustine, nay. Senator San Nicolas. Senator San Nicolas, aye. Vice Speaker Talahi. Vice Speaker Talahi, aye. Senator Torres. Senator Torres, pass. Senator Adda. Senator Adda, nay. Senator Castro. Senator Castro, nay. Senator Muñoz. Senator Muñoz, nay. Senator Torres. Senator Torres, nay.
On the vote of the amendment, 4 ayes, 9 nays, 2 absent. Amendment fails. Senator San Nicolas, you're the last speaker on this particular legislation 154-37. Any other amendment?
Yes,
Senator San
Mr.
Nicolas.
Chairman. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make an amendment starting on page 25, line 26. After the reference to Title 12 GCA subsection 12116, page 25, starting on line 26. After the reference to Title 12 GCA subsection 12116, replace the comma with a period and strike the remainder of that section all the way to page 26, line 17.
Okay, on Senator San Nicolas's amendment on page 25, after subsection 12116, line 26, insert a period and delete all subsequent language to page 26. What line, Senator San Nicolas?
Line 17.
Line 17, all the way through the balance of that particular section. On the amendment, I'm going to call the amendment. All those, any objection?
Mr. Chairman, right here.
Yes, Senator.
Before we move too fast, if I could just take a moment just to be able to read what this section does and by the elimination of it, what the ramifications might be. And so if you just give us a few seconds to read it.
Okay, 1 minute recess.
Thank you.
The committee in the whole is back in session. Senator Espaldon, you have the floor
Thank
on
you.
the proposed amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask GITA representative, Ms. Garcia, if she could actually answer a question for me. Ms. Garcia, in the sidebars that we had during this little recess, as well as in days previous, whether it was yesterday or day before yesterday, it was argued, right, that because the Port Authority has established credit, has taken out loans locally at the bank level, that our credit rating should be good, so long as, of course, and we trust that the payments have been made on time and they have not defaulted on anything. The question then is, when you go to the bond market, is that credit rating, because we borrowed locally at a local bank, the same kind of scrutiny that the bond market then looks at the customer, in this case the port, and use that as their determination of whether they're a good risk or not going forward? Or is it a whole different set of criteria that the bond market uses and other kinds of analyses to be able to determine what rates we're going to get and how attractive we are and so forth?
Thank you for the question. The rating process for the bond market, and it's established, it's a printed criteria, basically is totally different from the bank credit. They're talking a 25 to 30-year financing. They look at where the bank, they strictly look at the financing repayment ability. When you're looking at the port, they look at everything from the economy of Guam. How are you paying your bills? Are you paying your utility bills on time? And they do look at everything. They look at your litigation, your exposure to litigation. And so the process is more intense. It requires more detail on the total Guam picture, as opposed versus the bank credit is very, it's recognized that you have a bank loan and you've paid it, but they don't look at it beyond that. Other than, again, the credit rating has 5 or 6 criteria that they look at, and not just one.
And not just the credit that we've established because of the bank loan.
That's correct.
Okay. Do you understand the motion that's before the floor right now, before the body right now, Ms. Garcia? And that would be essentially on page 25 of the bill, on line 26.
Okay.
At the very right after Title 12 GCA Section 12116, the motion was to put a period after that, and then all the verbiage after that period will be deleted, all the way to the very end of this section, which goes on into the next page, line 26, all the way to line 7. I mean, page 26, all the way to line 17. Now, the reason why I'm asking you is because the representation has been made that, of course, GITA, in working with the bond counsel and the underwriters and whatnot, are the ones who helped craft this piece of legislation to be able to have to make the port more attractive on the bond market. The question then becomes, should we delete this particular section, or the portion of this section of 10203? Does that have any negative ramifications to perhaps make us less attractive in terms of to investors? or will it destroy any confidence, or will it take away a positive perspective of Guam and perhaps, or would it create a hole that investors would be looking for and saying, we don't see this section? I guess in simple terms, is this a real critical section to have in here?
Yes. And I say that especially because it just restates again that the board has a requirement, again, to issue bonds for the system. And then second, that as it relates to the Organic Act and indebtedness, again, indebtedness occurs only with legislative approval as stated in the beginning of this section. And that, again, it's one of those critical sections that establishes the autonomy of the authority. You're stating the authority, the port in this case, is going to be solely responsible. Their revenues are going to be used to pledge the debt. And secondly, it's not going to affect the general government's debt ceiling.
Right, and that's the way I kind of read it myself. I mean, although there have been some arguments made that, you know, that really kind of, I believe, that differ. And so I'm just trying to understand, and I really sincerely am, Mr. Chair, trying to understand the opinions of our colleagues as to the effects of this and really what it really does or does not do. But again, I just wanted I want to thank Gita for the answers they just gave, and I didn't know what she was going to say. But again, like I said, in previous days, there was an argument that our credit, because we've borrowed from local banks, that establishes our credit rating that's good enough to survive the scrutiny of the bond market. And Gita basically is saying, again, with their expertise and background, having gone to the bond market, that there's a whole different set of criteria that is used when going to the bond market to borrow there over the long term. And it's not just on the ability to repay, but economic factors, exposure to liability, and other factors. Gita is now saying that by the removal of this section, or what is being proposed, that this, well, actually, let me put it another way. This section that's being proposed to be deleted is still an important piece of this legislation going forward to the bond market. Right now, particularly on this particular bond borrowing. In future bond borrowings, though, is it real critical to have this section? Because yesterday you stated that when we go, since this is the port's first time to go to the bond market and incur indebtedness there, right, that we established a master indenture. And so, and then after that, should the port need to go to the bond market after that, they could go under the approval of that master indenture, and it would be a lot easier to do.
Yes, and the supplemental indentures will have the same conditions as the master.
Right.
So when we agree to this, it'll continue on through subsequent indentures.
Well, the question becomes, and because there seems to be, and it was stated earlier by previous colleagues, that there's a general consensus that we really would like to help the port go to the bond market on this particular bond borrowing that we're trying to approve. But the real friction is, because there's two parts to this bill, it's the first part they have trouble with, or some of our colleagues have trouble with, and that is creating a whole new section, deleting the existing law right now and creating a whole new section of the terms and conditions in which the port can go and borrow funds. Right? The question then becomes, if this section is important for this initial bond borrowing, the first of the port on the bond market, right? Can we take this section and put it under Section 3 but delete it from the proposed rules going forward for all future bond borrowings?
What I would say to you is, going back to the criteria and for entering the bond market, one of the major items I did not mention was that they do look at how the governance of the port is handled, and they look at, you know, what are the risks to outside forces coming in to impact those revenues, their pledge to the bondholders. And that is, they look at, you know, we go through an extensive discussion on their board, how they're elected, we go through how their tariffs are established and how they're maintained. And so that's, and then they also look at GITA's authority. Still, they recognize GITA as being there to ensure that the legislature's approval is in there. And by keeping it here, again, you're creating a master indenture for the bond, which says the board is going to do this. If you put it just for the first set of bond, then what could happen, and again, creating an interest rate risk, is in the second bond you issue, then you may counter it because you're saying it's only for that bond. And that's why when we created this section, it's saying our first set is to create this master commitment. You know, we're committing that, you know, the board's autonomy will be maintained, their tariffs will be maintained, and so on. And then the second part of that is, under these commitments and pledges, we want to borrow funds. If you just put it under that first set of funds, it's going to be a red flag, because you're not agreeing to put it for future bonds under this indenture. And so again, you're saying that the board, and that's a major component of borrowing, as it exists today, has the ability, the autonomy, but in 5 years, it may change. And if that changes in 5 years, that creates a whole new playing field for the investors. So again, what we're doing here on this section is creating the autonomy, the governance, and giving that port that base to issue bonds. And then the next section 3 and 4 is under this base, we're requesting for bonds. So by putting it under the current authority, it could be seen as a credit risk.
Thank you. One of the concerns that we're hearing over and over again from the floor is that the way this legislation, not the bond borrowing part, but setting the rules for how Port Authority goes to the market and the authority, the fear is that the legislature, through this new language, is going to be, or the governor, is going to be taken out of any responsibility or in terms of decision making or oversight or the ability to review, and everything is going to fall just on the port board to make a decision to go to market. Now, the other day you stated that under this section, because it is invoked under Chapter 50, Title 12, the board through GITA has the power. Bottom line, GITA, and you stated that, well, in that section governing GITA, it requires that the governor and the legislature are part of the process. That still stands?
Yes.
and that will always still stand.
That absolutely will stand.
In terms of your understanding of this rewrite, since you did it in concert with the bond counsel and others, right? Are there any other areas in this proposal, not the bond borrowing section, but the laying the rules for how the port goes forward? Are there any areas in here that actually then, notwithstanding GITA's statute, right, does it allow the board of the port to go forward without any participation by the legislature or the governor?
Absolutely not. The way it is written, legislative approval is required for every bond issuance.
Okay. The other thing that I need to ask you, since you've stated that you've been with GITA since
I've been with GITA since 1998. I've been in the bond business since 2001.
2001, 2002, so a good 15, 16, 17 years, something like that. In all the times that you can, and of course we're very familiar with you in past legislatures where you and some others from GITA have come down every time there was a bond measure that was to be floated. The issue I need to address, because it was stated by a colleague on a sidebar conversation, that normally the bond indenture will come down to the legislature for our scrutiny and approval. Do you agree with that?
No. It came down once, maybe.
I believe so. I think I remember in one of my past terms.
I object. That's not correct. I mean, I've
Well,
been here
Mr.
since
Chair-
Senator
Mr. Chair, if
Speaker
that's a
San
point of,
Augustine was
Mr. Chair, if
the
that's a point of
speaker.
I'm
information,
sorry,
then
Madam
she
Vice
can raise the
Speaker.
point of information. I still have
Senator
the floor.
Espadon has the floor. Senator Espadon, you may proceed.
And I'm asking the representative from GITA, and if she disagrees, she'll have a chance to counter. But right now, again, she can't object to my line of questioning or even the
you still have
answers
the
that's
floor,
being
Senator.
given. And so your recollection is maybe once or twice, and I believe it was a major bond borrowing by GPA at the time. It was for some outrageous amount, I mean, some really big amount. But I mean, the question is, specifically, the indenture itself, has the legislature ever taken a look, aside perhaps from that one or two exceptions, on all the bond borrowings? Has that come down in terms of the indenture so that we have scrutinized it and gone through each and every item to make sure we can approve it? Is that a normal practice?
No.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I'll give up some time right now if others would like to chime in, but I appreciate you calling back Gita so that she could answer the questions.
Thank you very much, Senator Espadon. Speaker Cruz, you had your hands raised on the amendment.
Okay, just to follow up on one of the questions that he asked. You've been there not 16 years now. How many general obligation bonds have been floated by the authority in the 16 years?
We did the 2009 general obligation bond. There was a 20, well, that was a long. So the last one we did was the 2009, and I'll go into the history to.
Do you know that went to referenda?
No. Did that go to referendum? Is that
Yes.
what- oh.
Under a separate section that GITA is required to bring it down to us. It was brought down to the legislature, yes. We approved it. But did you or the legislature follow the other section that requires that a general obligation bond go to referendum?
Speaker, I'm going to have to verify the exact language, but I believe there was a notwithstanding section.
I understand. And the reason why I have objected since the beginning about this is that taking out the governor and the legislature specifically in this And depending on it going to GIDA to bring it back to us, you now have 3 boards, 3 non-elected boards that can do whatever they want. At least now, though they're claiming it's a political reason that I'm insisting on referenda for a bond, that at least it's because we are elected. But what's going to happen with 3 unelected, you have the Port Board that's unelected, you have the PUC Board that's unelected, you have the GIDA Board that's unelected. They don't have to answer to anybody except the appointing authority. And even then, under this, you guys have no problem taking that office out. I'm just saying, you know, with all the argument of that you can't tie it to previous legislatures, and notwithstanding, my fear of taking us out specifically in this is that we will be irrelevant, and we will have delegated under legal terms, but truly abdicated in real terms, our powers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Speaker Cruz. On the amendment, we're going to call for the vote. On the amendment, there's been an expression of objection. Senators, Senator Nelson, you have 3 minutes. Senators, and then I will go around and entertain others. Yes, Vice Speaker Talai, you're after Senator Nelson.
Thank you,
Senator
Mr.
Nelson,
Chair.
you have the floor.
I have a question for Ms. Garcia. Because we're talking about ensuring the system in this amendment, what happens if the revenue of the system declines? Because in the OPA report, there's been a decline in certain revenues. So what happens if the revenue of the system declines and we basically pledged the revenue of the system? What happens? Does it affect the assets of the port?
No.
Does the bond covenant hold anything that the investor can take away and sell someplace else?
No.
Okay.
What happens is the tariffs will have to be adjusted to meet O&M and debt service.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nelson. Senator Vice Speaker Talai, you have the
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
on the amendment.
On this amendment, yes. I would just want to find out, did GIDA, when they ran this through their underwriters, the analysis, which I haven't seen, by the way, did they include the liability for the $14 million as part of the port's liability? Is that the scenario that this is going out with?
Whenever we do any bonds, we do disclose litigation, all litigation pending and so on. And so our documents will include disclosure of the litigation you speak of.
So was the analysis done as with that reflected in the, as part of liability?
No,
Or just, you're saying you just disclosed the litigation, but did they do calculations based on what if that is a liability? Because the port has represented to us in the public hearings that they have no capacity to take care of that liability, and that they're going to put it back to the legislature, and the people will go on to take care of that liability. And I want to know, what did GIDA do when it went out, or it's going out and getting its estimates? Because, the legislature did not raise the tariffs. The PUC did, and even the PUC said they're going to come back to us in case they lose that case, because that liability changes everything. It changes the, ability to whether they're going to use the increased tariffs for this or for something else like that, I guess. And so that's why I think it's very important to know what is your analysis, your financial analysis, did it include that as a liability or not?
It did not, and we disclosed the statement and put the PUC statement.
Right, because, yes, I just worry that the language in the bill, especially without removing or adopting this this motion to amend is it really allows, it almost mandates, as you described to the previous speaker, mandates increase in tariffs for almost any change to the port. And I worry about that, especially when PUC did not include that liability as part of these current tariffs. It's almost like we are guaranteeing an increase in tariffs with any change and in case of that court loss, or that the legislature is going to come back here. We can't come back here to change the expanded autonomy of the port because we will have committed to it in this bill, but we can come back here to pick up their liabilities, right? That's kind of how this is being designed. So I support the amendment, Mr. Chair, and I think Gita, I mean, I too, you know, Ms. Garcia is a personal friend of mine, and I very much appreciate her professionalism in answering all our questions. I think that, but it, you know, it very clearly shows that increased autonomy of the port. I mean, you can come in here and say it's because it's necessary to float this bond, but it wasn't necessary when the PUC was calculating, you know, whether to increase tariffs, and we have no say in those tariffs. We have no say in what happened in that YTK. You know, we didn't have say back then, and we're really restricting our ability to do our duty, our due diligence, our hard work, our rewrite if necessary, just to protect the people of Guam.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Senator Nelson, please state your point of order.
I believe, I didn't hear if that was a question of the expansion of the board, the liability of the tariff. Was that a question?
I'm sorry, Senator Nelson, state your point of order with regards to the process. Vice Speaker Talai. Thank you. On the proposed amendment, on page 25, after the numerical number 1216, line 26, insert a period and delete the subsequent section to the next page, page 26, line 17. All those, there's been an expression of objection. All those in favor of
Mr.
the
Chairman,
amendment?
may I close on the amendment? I didn't even speak on the opening. I've just allowed for everyone else to speak on it, but I would like to speak on the amendment at least to close.
Senator San Nicolas, please close. You got 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's been some representations made that somehow this language is necessary in order to affect the credit of the bond that's being pursued in Section 3. Mr. Chairman, I find that to be materially false. This language is strictly language that grants the authority of the board to go out and seek bonds. We are already discussing the bond in this Section 3. We are already considering the approval of the board and the authority to be able to go out and float this bond in this Section 3. This language, what this language actually does is it speaks to all prospective indebtedness that the board and the authority may be interested in pursuing. And there's very specific words in this particular language that I'm trying to remove with this strike through. I'm trying to remove the part that says that this grants the board to exercise any and all of its powers granted by this article. I'm trying to strike the part that makes a declaration with respect to Organic Act interpretation so that we're not pre-stating where this legislature stands with respect to whether or not the debt should come before this body. I'm striking through the language that says that the board may authorize the authority, the Port Authority, to incur indebtedness. By striking that language through, we're not going to prevent the bond from moving forward. The rating agencies aren't going to look at us as having stricken this language and say, oh, we're going to give you a lower credit rating. That was materially false. They don't look at what we strike through in our bills to decide what kind of credit rating they give a bond. All they look at is what was authorized. They look at the authorization in the context of the asset and the market, and then they give the rating. They don't look at what we strike through in a bill. If it was authorized under law, they're good to go. I don't understand why that was stated on the record by the GITA representative when it is in fact untrue. Actions of this body aren't considered when determining the rating of a bond. There's further clarification that needs to be made because we're questioning GITA as if they are the rating agency or that they have any kind of rating power. The reality is GITA does not have anything to do with the rating, neither does the underwriter. As a matter of fact, as a matter of legislative notice, ratings are actually handled by a separate entity. You have S&P, you have Moody's, you have Fitch. An underwriter is never a rating agency. They may advise what they think the rating might be, but what we've had represented by the GITA official present is that this is an entirely new issue. This is the first time for the port. This is the first time for this particular type of bond to be floated. How can you even speak towards what you think the rating will be based on what the underwriter has to say when they aren't even the rating agency? If this is entirely new for everybody, all we have is our best estimates. And what GITA has been representing to us throughout these last 6 days is give us everything that you can possibly give us so that we can go out and get the best rating possible. And yes, that's potentially true. But you don't go and over-obligate yourselves without fully understanding what the consequences of that obligation is and what the reward is with respect to that commitment.
Senator St. Nicholas, please wrap it up.
Mr. Chairman, there was line of questioning prior to me that took maybe 3 or 4 times longer than my statement that put certain information on the record that I believe needs to be addressed. If striking through this language doesn't affect the rating at all...
Senator St. Nicholas, you're closing your comments on the amendment.
Yes, I'm speaking to that. If striking through this language does not affect the rating at all, why is the GITA representative implying, or I'm sorry, stating on the record under oath that striking it through may affect the interest rate? This has nothing to do with the interest rate. This has to do with whether or not the board, through the port, is going to be able to go out and borrow in the future based on what's written in this article. Section 3 already speaks to the bond. I've motioned to strike through this section for one and only one purpose, Mr. Chairman, to make sure that any debt similar to the debt in Section 3 comes before this body and gets approved or at least considered by Legislatura prior to anybody being able to move it forward. The way this section is written,
Senator St. Nicholas,
we
you're
are
wrapping up on
abdicating.
your amendment.
It is
I've
step
asked
one
you
towards abdicating
to please
that
wrap it up.
power. And so I humbly ask my colleagues to support the strike through of this language and to join me as we move forward through the remainder of the measure to protect the people from us surrendering their very sacred authority to incur more indebtedness on their port.
Thank you, Senator St. Nicholas. On the proposed
Point of
amendment...
information, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Senator Nelson, please state your point of information.
Would the GITA representative like to clarify the previous statements made?
I'm going to call for the vote. Thank you very much, Senator Nelson. On the proposed amendment, there's been an objection signified. All those in favor of the proposed amendment, please signify by raising your hands. Seven votes. Amendment fails. Senator St. Nicholas? As a matter of fact, Senator St. Nicholas, at the inception, you requested that we revert back to Section 2, and after your initial opening statements and some proposed amendments, and I consented a few days ago to allow for the body, based on your request, to come back and consider the repeal of Section 2. That was done prior to these last 2 amendments. So I will entertain one additional amendment, Senator St. Nicholas, with your indulgence. and then we'll press.
For the record, Mr. Chairman, I am speaking towards Section 2. And when I deferred my previous statements, it was with respect to allowing other members of this body to discuss, but I did not defer my ability to discuss.
I'm not withholding your ability as a member of this body to discuss. You have had that opening opportunity more than a few times, Senator San Nicolas. Please proceed.
On page 28, line 5 through 13. Wait, hang on, Mr. Chairman. I just want to clarify. Are you only allowing me to propose one more amendment? Is that what you're stating?
Yes, because you had an opportunity at the opening of the discussion of Bill 157-34 to be able to discuss it and proffer several amendments at that time. You requested that you be given an opportunity to come back and can reconsider the possible removal or deletion of Section 2. I yielded to that, plus 2 additional amendments.
Mr. Chairman, in this committee of the whole, members have been, to include panel members, have been allowed to constantly come back and speak towards
Senator
the same
San
thing
Nicolas,
over and over again.
Senator San Nicolas, yes, and you even alluded to it. This is the 6th day that we're discussing this particular measure. And in addition to that, we've had a copy of this particular proposal for the last week, even prior.
I've been here all
was
6
the
days
introduction.
during the discussion.
I am not in any way, shape, or form trying to suppress discussion, but we need to respect our other colleagues also.
I'm just asking for the same ability to speak towards the measure as everyone
Senator
else has
San
been
Nicolas,
afforded
you
to.
have the floor. Do you have an amendment? We're entertaining amendments at this
Before
time.
I proceed with the amendment, Mr. Chairman, I need to clarify, am I going to be allowed to proffer other amendments after this? Or are you only going to allow me to offer this one amendment?
I have said I will entertain your next amendment. Senator San Nicolas, please proceed. Please proceed.
But after this amendment, will I be able to offer others?
Senator San Nicolas, please proceed.
That needs to be clarified, Mr. Chairman, because otherwise I'll need to decide which one amendment I'm going to want to do.